The early summer of 1986 had brought more than just warmth to California's Sierra Nevada. It had brought the kind of restless energy that makes young couples crave the wild. The smell of pine sap, the hush of ancient canyons, and the kind of silence that only exists when you're more than 20 m from the nearest paved road. Rebecca and Daniel Whitaker, both 26, had just returned from their honeymoon in Lake Tahoe and were already planning their next escape. They weren't wealthy, but they were spirited. Daniel, a public school history teacher, and Rebecca, a freelance illustrator who loved painting forests and birds, had grown tired of wedding receptions and family brunches. They wanted seclusion, and Yosemite, vast, unspoiled, and sacred to them, was where they intended to find it. They packed their red 1981 Ford Bronco with supplies for a 4-day backcountry hike. Daniel, ever the planner, marked their route on a topographical map and made a note to visit Wapama Falls, a lesser-known cascade in the HCH Valley, far removed from the tourist-laden trails of Useed Valley. It was the kind of place they could pitch a tent beside glacial boulders and drink from the stream without seeing another soul for days. They left from their apartment in Stockton on June 4th, promising Rebecca's sister they'd be back by the evening of the 8th. It wasn't their first time off-grid. Daniel had hiked sections of the John Muir Trail in college, and Rebecca had grown up camping with her parents. To their friends, they were the kind of people who didn't just survive in the wilderness, they thrived in it. But June 8th came and went, then the 9th, then the 10th. On the 11th, Rebecca's sister filed a missing persons report. The Whiters were gone, and no one knew it yet. But 13 years would pass before a single trace of them would resurface behind the roar of falling water. On the morning of June 11, 1986, the Tuolumne County Sheriff's Office dispatched 2 deputies to Yosemite's HCH entrance station. The park rangers had no record of Daniel or Rebecca Whitaker checking in, but that wasn't unusual. The entrance to that part of the park was often unmanned, and backcountry permits weren't always enforced with consistency. In the 1980s, Sheriff's Deputy Mark Ellison, a seasoned man with 15 years on the force, led the initial effort. He was accompanied by Ranger Caroline Watts, who knew the terrain of HCH better than most. They started with Daniel's topo map left behind in the Whitaker's apartment, a map marked with highlighter and handwritten notes. Camp here, water source, ridge view, last day, Wapama Falls. That last note immediately stood out. Wapama Falls was remote, not a typical trail destination for casual hikers. It was beautiful. Yes, a thunderous waterfall cutting through granite cliffs, but also risky. Slippery boulders, uneven paths, sudden stream surges. Caroline had seen twisted ankles, even a dislocated shoulder, all within half a mile of that trail. Search teams were organized quickly. 2 helicopters were flown in from Modesto to survey the area. They looked for the signature red of the Bronco or the gleam of reflective tent material. Nothing. Volunteers from Useed Search and Rescue hiked the trail in teams of 2, calling out names and checking ravines. They found no campsite, no trash, no signs of struggle, and no Ford Bronco in any of the nearby lots. On June 14th, a week after the couple's supposed return, the sheriff's office released a formal statement to local news. We are conducting an active search for Daniel and Rebecca Whitaker, last seen entering the Yosemite backcountry on June 4th. Any information from hikers or nearby residents is requested immediately. Tips began to trickle in. A gas station clerk in Groveland thought he saw a man matching Daniel's description buying trail mix and bottled water. Another witness claimed they'd seen a woman with dark hair and a backpack hiking alone near Lake Eleanor, but none of it could be verified. None of it was enough. By June 20th, the official search was scaled down. Deputies left the backcountry. Helicopters were reassigned. The case slipped from the headlines and from memory. Just another unsolved disappearance in America's vast wilderness. But not for the families. Rebecca's sister, Emily Holbrook, refused to let it rest. She kept a file of everything. Ranger logs, weather reports, articles, even tips from self-proclaimed psychics. And every year on June 4th, she returned to the trailhead near HCH Hetch with fresh flyers. She told the park rangers, "I'm not leaving until someone finds something." She had no idea. It would take 13 years, 1 freak drought, and a shift in the river's course to finally reveal what nature had hidden. From the outside, time moved on. By 1988, Daniel and Rebecca Whitaker's names had faded from newspaper clippings and bulletin boards. The Stockton Record published a 2-year retrospective, calling it the honeymoon that never ended, but interest quickly waned. Other disappearances, other tragedies filled the airwaves. But for Emily Holbrook, Rebecca's sister, the years were not marked by birthdays or holidays. They were marked by absence. Every time she passed UC's foothills on her way to visit her parents, the landscape itself felt like it was withholding a secret. Silent, ancient, indifferent. She kept the Whitakers' apartment lease active for 2 years, unwilling to let it go. In the 3rd year, she boxed their books, dishes, Daniel's teaching materials, and Rebecca's sketch pads. She stored them in her attic, untouched, like a shrine that belonged to a future still waiting to arrive. Daniel's parents moved to Oregon in 1991, too grief-stricken to remain in the same neighborhood. Rebecca's mother passed in 1993. Her father stopped answering the phone when reporters called on anniversaries. Hope hadn't died, but it had been quietly buried beneath routine. Then in the spring of 1999, California experienced one of its driest years on record. Snowpack in the Sierra Nevada melted weeks ahead of schedule. Rivers and streams that normally roared in early summer slowed to a whisper. And in the high valley, Wapama Falls won a thunderous, impenetrable veil of water, thinned dramatically. A pair of wildlife researchers, Dr. Helen Kwong and his assistant Jason Melvin, were hiking the area to track osprey nesting patterns when they decided to photograph the fall from a less common angle. Helen had been coming to Yosemite for years, but with the water at record lows, she saw a dry rock face behind the waterfall that she'd never seen fully exposed. Jason was adjusting the tripod when Helen paused. Something caught her near the base of the falls. At first, she thought it was just a weathered branch lodged in the rocks. But as they got closer, the shape became clearer, metallic, partially rusted and rectangular. Jason crouched and brushed away the moss and lichen. His fingers touched faded red paint. Then they saw it. A corner of a license plate wedged between stone and sediment. California tag barely legible but unmistakably there. Helen didn't speak. She just stepped back, her breath catching as she reached for her radio. Yosemite Dispatch. This is Dr. Helen Kwong. I think we found something. Something big. By the time the park rangers arrived at the base of Wapama Falls, the sun had already dropped behind the cliffs, casting long shadows over the valley. The sound of the waterfall was reduced to a soft murmur, revealing the quiet rustle of the wind in the trees and the distant call of an owl. Ranger Caroline Watts, now a supervisor, nearing retirement, was the first to respond. When the name Wapama Falls came to the radio, she felt something shift deep inside her. She remembered the Whitaker case vividly. The handwritten map, the fruitless searches, the unanswered questions. As she climbed down toward the location marked by Dr. Kwong, she tried not to hope. After so many years, you learn to temper hope with caution. What they found was more than she expected. The red metal structure was unmistakably a vehicle door, long corroded, but still intact enough to identify. Nearby, caught between boulders and covered in moss and lichen, was a twisted fragment of roof paneling painted in the same faded red. Embedded deep in the river rock was the frame of a 1981 Ford Bronco, buried for over a decade behind the waterfall spray. The sheer force of the water year after year had hidden it from view, but that wasn't all. A few meters away, caught in the roots of a downed tree, a blue nylon backpack had surfaced. The stitching frayed, but the straps still intact. Inside, protected by a plastic bag, was a water-damaged sketch pad, and despite the blur of the ink, one image remained clear, a penciled drawing of Wapama Falls. Caroline's breath caught in her throat. She turned to her team. Seal the area. Nobody touches anything until forensics gets here. That night, the news spread like wildfire across the Ranger network. By morning, it had reached the Tuolumne County Sheriff's Office. Deputy Mark Ellison, long since retired, received a call at home. He sat in silence for several minutes after hanging up. Then he opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out an old case file marked with 2 names he had never forgotten, Daniel and Rebecca Whitaker. By June 3rd, 1999, the area surrounding Bama Falls had been cordoned off with yellow tape and steel stakes, guarded by a rotating team of rangers. State forensic analysts arrived the following morning with one mission: determine if the wreckage and artifacts found behind the falls were indeed connected to the Long Cold Whitaker case. It didn't take long. The license plate, though rusted and covered in silt, bore a partial number for DHW 63, matching the Whitakers' 1981 Ford Bronco, confirmed through old DMV records. That alone would have been enough to reopen the case. But what came next sealed it. Inside a sealed metal thermos tucked under the collapsed passenger seat, the forensic team found a plastic bag with film rolls, remarkably preserved by the dry interior and layers of compacted silt. After 2 days of meticulous processing at a Sacramento lab, 5 images were recovered. One photo showed Rebecca smiling, her boots dipped in a shallow stream, trees surrounding her like curtains of green. Another showed Daniel crouching near a small fire, grinning with blackened marshmallow on his thumb. The last photo, the most haunting, was dated June 6, 1986. It was a wide shot of Wapama Falls. Water spraying in full force, and just visible in the foreground, their tent nestled between the rocks, perilously close to the river's edge. The images left no doubt. They had made it to the falls. But the question remained, what happened next? No remains had been recovered. No signs of trauma, no bones, no personal items beside the backpack and film. But geologists working alongside the team offered a theory. In the spring of 1986, just 2 weeks after the couple's presumed arrival, Yosemite had experienced an unexpected surge in snow melt, doubling the volume of HCH's river systems in a matter of days. The surge, combined with loose rock formations around the base of the falls, could have caused a mudslide or washout, sweeping the Bronco down from a temporary camp and burying it behind the Waterfall's current. If the Whitakers had been inside when it happened, or even nearby, the force of the water would have been overwhelming and deadly. But that theory didn't explain everything. The tent was never found, nor were their bodies. And when Emily Holbrook, Rebecca's sister, was brought to the site under ranger escort, she stood in silence for a full minute before whispering, "This isn't where they planned to stay. This just wasn't the camp." Emily's words echoed through the trees. This wasn't the camp. Ranger Caroline watched raise an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Emily stepped closer to the rock face where the Bronco had been recovered. She studied the landscape, the incline, the proximity to the falls, the unstable ground littered with broken stone and slick moss. It wasn't just unsafe, it was irrational. Rebecca was meticulous about terrain. Emily said, her voice steady. She kept a field journal. She'd never camped this close to water that could surge overnight. She would have found a ridge, something with drainage and shelter. Caroline looked down at the folder in her hands. The original map Daniel had marked in 1986. The last handwritten note was still there in faded ink. Last day, Wapama Falls. It had always been assumed this is where they camped. But Emily's doubt introduced a new possibility. What if Wapama wasn't their campsite, but their final stop before heading out? The team expanded the search grid, now treating Wapama not as a destination, but point of transition. If the Bronco ended up there, perhaps it had been moved, not by natural forces, but deliberately. A new detail backed up the suspicion. The driver's seatbelt was clipped in but twisted, suggesting it may have been fastened without anyone inside. And forensic analysis of the seat rails showed no pressure weight at the time of the vehicle's final movement. In short, it's possible the Bronco was empty when it was pushed. This changed everything. Was it an accident? A desperate attempt to hide evidence? Or was someone else out there in the woods that week? Park logs showed no other backcountry permits in that region between June 4th and 9th, but those records were spotty at best. In 1986, it was unusual for campers to head out unregistered. If someone crossed paths with Daniel and Rebecca, no one would have known. And then another development. A retired ranger named Harold Mendoza, who had worked the HCH-HCHE trails that summer, came forward with a memory that had haunted him for years. "I saw a man up there, maybe June 6th or 7th, alone. Didn't have a permit. He said he was camping off trail. Didn't think much of it at the time. He described a man as in his 30s with a beard, tan jacket, and a limp. The ranger never took a name, never wrote it down, but he'd always felt something wasn't right. That witness statement, though nearly 13 years old, was enough for the sheriff's office to reopen the case. This time, as a suspicious disappearance, Emily looked across the waterfall and whispered to herself, "They weren't alone out here." The reopened case file landed on the desk of Detective Linda Monroe, a sharp, detail-oriented investigator with the Taylormy County Sheriff's Department. She wasn't new to cold cases. She'd worked two that ended in convictions despite being over a decade old. But this one was different. It involved the wilderness. It involved silence. It involved a vehicle deliberately pushed into a waterfall. Monroe began with the original ranger interview, Harold Mendoza, the retired HCHHCC trailman. His memory, despite the years, was crisp. He remembered the man clearly. He wasn't just limping. Mendoza said he was dragging his left leg a bit like it was injured or worn down from an old accident. That detail, a dragging limp, became the focal point of Monroe's efforts. She issued a request to the National Park Service for any incident reports from 1986 involving hikers in the Wapama or Lake Eleanor region. One document stood out, a handwritten entry in a ranger log dated June 7th, 1986, referencing an unidentified man seen fishing illegally near Tiltil Creek. The note included only a brief physical description. White male, approximate 35 to 40, unkempt beard, visible limp, declined to give name. This was the second sighting. Monroe contacted the ranger who wrote that note, Don Sutter, now long retired and living in Oregon. On a recorded phone call, he confirmed the interaction. He didn't have a permit, said he liked solitude, gave me a weird look when I asked where his camp was. I remember because, well, something about him felt wrong, like he didn't belong out there, but also didn't care that he didn't. Armed with the descriptions, Monroe built a rough composite sketch and issued an internal request through law enforcement networks for any individuals with criminal records matching the physical traits and presence in Northern California during the 1980s. Two names surfaced. The second one was ruled out quickly, serving time in Nevada during the disappearance. But the first, a man named Ethan Voss, born 1950, had a history of trespassing, minor assaults, and mental instability. Arrested in 1984 for squatting near Big Sioux, released in 1985. No address after 1986. Last known location, Groveland, California, about 35 miles from UC's west entrance. Ethan had a documented left leg injury, the result of a logging accident in Oregon in 1978. The connection was thin, circumstantial at best, but Monroe couldn't shake it. She pulled his mug shot and compared it to the composite. The resemblance was striking, but Ethan Voss had vanished from the system in late 1986. No known residence, no death certificate, no next of kin, which raised a chilling possibility. What if 3 people disappeared in UC that week? Detective Linda Monroe leaned back in her chair, staring at the photo of Ethan Voss, the man with the limp. The last documented trace of him dated back to October 1986, when he was issued a citation for loitering in Oakdale, California. After that, it was as if he had evaporated. No arrests, no credit, no death record. Monroe scrolled 3 names across her whiteboard. Daniel Whitaker, Rebecca Whitaker, Ethan Voss. The Whiters had vanished in June 1986. Ethan had vanished a few months later, but the proximity of time and place couldn't be ignored. Yosemite wasn't just scenic. It was isolated, a perfect place to disappear or make someone else disappear. She flew to Stockton to meet with Emily Holbrook again. Do these names or photos mean anything to you? Monroe asked, laying Ethan's image next to Daniel and Rebecca's. Emily stared at the photo of Ethan Voss for a long time. Then she slowly shook her head. No, but that doesn't mean anything. They weren't the kind of people who talk about strangers. They were private, especially on their trips. Still, Monroe pressed forward. She met with park historians, interviewed retired rangers, and visited the site herself. She stood at the exact location where the Ford Bronco had been pulled from beneath the waterfall. The roar of water had returned with late summer runoff, but Monroe imagined the scene in 1986. The vehicle parked just a few yards from the base of the falls. The tent nowhere in sight, no tracks, no bodies. Then she walked the trail backward, tracing the Whitakers' supposed path from Lake Eleanor down to Wapama Falls. Along the way, something caught her eye, a narrow offshoot from the main trail, overgrown with pine needles and underbrush. It wasn't on any modern map. She followed it for a few minutes until it widened slightly into a small clearing. Sunlight broke through the trees. A circle of stones hinted at an old fire ring. There was no trash, no signs of a struggle, just silence. But her instincts prickled. She marked the coordinates and returned with a forensics team the next day. On the second sweep of the clearing, they found something. Just below the surface of the soft earth, a zippered pouch emerged, cracked, weather-worn, but still intact. Inside was a small sealed notebook, handwritten in tight cursive, smudged from years of moisture. The cover bore only 2 words: Daniel's Journal. The journal was handed over to forensics with extreme care. Despite years underground, the pouch had done a remarkable job protecting its contents. The ink on some pages had bled slightly, and the corners were warped, but most of the writing remained legible. Detective Monroe had it scanned, cataloged, and placed into evidence. The first few pages were unremarkable. Short notes about trail conditions, campfire locations, and Rebecca's drawings. But midway through the journal, the tone changed. June 6, 1986. Hiked south toward Wama. R's knees sore from yesterday's climb. Stopped earlier than planned. Set up camp near Creek Bend. Nice spot, flat, good cover. That matched the approximate location where the journal was found. It wasn't near the falls. It was upstream, at least 2 miles away. Further entries described a peaceful routine, cooking simple meals, sketching, reading aloud to one another. There was even a list titled things to do when we get back with scribbles like fix the roof leak, print film, and call Emily. But then came the final 2 entries. June 8, 1986. 5:10 p.m. Strange man passed by camp around noon. Didn't speak. Just looked at us. Then kept walking. Tan jacket, heavy limp. I was unsettled. I tried to play it off. Something about him didn't feel right. June 9, 1986. 6:45 a.m. Heard something last night. Footsteps. Definitely 2 legs. Slow scraping. Not an animal. Are thinks we should pack and leave early. I agree. Writing this quickly. If anyone finds this and we're not home by the 12th, something went wrong. We saw someone we weren't supposed to see. Detective Monroe read those words 3 times in silence. There was no further writing. No torn pages. Just that chilling last line left like a final breadcrumb. We saw someone we weren't supposed to see. Monroe knew she had to act. She issued a formal request to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, presenting the working theory. 2 hikers encountered a 3rd person. Days later, they disappeared. 13 years later, their vehicle was found deliberately hidden, and perhaps, just perhaps, their killer had also disappeared. When the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, received the file, it wasn't the first time they had been asked to assist with a wilderness disappearance. But what made the Whitaker case stand out was a journal entry, a direct indication of fear, a named encounter, and a location-based timeline. Special Agent Derek Holloway, a seasoned profiler known for working cases along the Appalachian Trail and Alaskan interior, was assigned to consult. Within hours of reviewing the evidence, he called Detective Monroe. This doesn't feel like an opportunistic crime. He said if Ethan Voss is involved, he either followed them intentionally or stumbled upon them and decided they were a threat. Agent Holloway focused on one behavioral detail, the act of hiding the vehicle. It wasn't dumped off a cliff. It wasn't left in plain sight. It was concealed behind a waterfall, a hiding spot that required knowledge of terrain and calculated effort. If this man pushed the Bronco behind the falls, it wasn't panic. It was cover-up. That analysis triggered the next step, a deeper search of the clearing where the journal had been buried. A cadaver dog team from Sacramento was deployed to the site. It was a quiet morning when they arrived, mist still hanging low over the trees. The dogs worked in wide circles, noses low, tails stiff. 20 minutes in, one of them froze near the base of a narrow ridge at the edge of the clearing. The forensic team began excavation. Just beneath a shallow layer of pine needles and earth, They found a canvas tarp knotted tight. Inside were remnants of clothing, buttons, and a rusted zipper, consistent with Daniel's jacket, confirmed by photos in Rebecca's film rolls. But then something else emerged. A bone fragment, a human humerus, broken and clean of tissue, then another, and finally a silver necklace tangled in the fabric. It was Rebecca's. The site was ruled a probable burial site, disturbed over time by weather and shallow earth. There wasn't enough DNA material for a full profile yet, but the implication was clear. This was where they died. Not by accident, not by nature, by force. The only person ever connected to this area by description, Ethan Voss. But Voss was a ghost. No fingerprints, no sightings, no address, no body. Gone since 1986. And the question remained, if this man was capable of murder, where did he go next? The discovery of the shallow grave sent ripples through both local and federal agencies. The coroner issued a preliminary identification based on clothing and personal effects, but full confirmation would require mitochondrial DNA, a process that could take weeks. Meanwhile, Detective Monroe pushed forward with the only real lead, Ethan Voss. She visited the Taylormy County Archives, digging into property logs, hospital records, and land transfer notices from the early 1980s. Buried in a handwritten ledger from 1985, she found something unusual. A fire permit issued to a man named E. Voss for an off-grid cabin just outside Groveland, 38 miles west of Wapama Falls. The cabin had burned down in 1987. Cause unknown. Owner never located. Monroe drove out to the overgrown property. There wasn't much left. Charred beams, collapsed tin roof, weeds climbing over the remnants of what had once been a porch. But as she stepped through the debris, she noticed a metal lockbox, blackened but intact, wedged between two scorched stones beneath the collapsed fireplace. She pried it open with a crowbar. Inside were loose pages smudged with ash, but legible. They weren't journals. They were sketches. Dozens of them. Each page bore faces, some realistic, some distorted. One was a woman walking through trees. Another was a man by a campfire. Others were less distinct. Silhouettes, wide eyes, jagged teeth, all done in pencil and charcoal. The disturbing part on the back of many pages were dates 1984, 1985, and 1986, along with what appeared to be locations. Stanislaw's Cherry Creek, Hetch Ridge, and then at the very bottom of the box, a final drawing. Two figures, a man and a woman, standing beside a waterfall. Detective Monroe sat down right there in the dirt, her hand trembling as she turned the page over. In faded pencil, it read the last ones. Back at the station, Monroe and Holloway reviewed the content of the box. It's not a confession, but it's damn close. These sketches, he was watching people, maybe stalking them, maybe worse. They requested a national database sweep for Ethan Voss's name, aliases and biometric data, cross, referencing with any missing persons in western states post-1986. And they got a hit. In Idaho, a man going by the name Eli Vaughn was arrested in 1990 for vagrancy. No fingerprints on record. Charges dropped. The arrest photo was grainy, but Monroe knew it was him. He changed his name, moved north, and vanished again. But that moment in 1990 gave them hope. Ethan or Eli may still be alive, or he may be buried in another forgotten grave. Either way, the case had shifted from a disappearance to a hunt. Detective Monroe worked into the early hours of the morning. The arrest photo of Eli Vaughn pinned beside Ethan Voss's mugshot on her board. The facial structure, hairline, and eyes were nearly identical despite the 5-year gap between records. The Idaho incident, though minor, was critical. It meant Ethan Voss, or someone go by another name, had resurfaced after the Whitakers' disappearance. And if he had resurfaced once, he might have done it again. Monroe contacted the Idaho Falls Police Department requesting case files and any officer reports tied to the arrest. One handwritten note stood out. Subject claimed to be living in a converted storage unit. Would not disclose exact location. Cooperated during questioning, but avoided eye contact. Had a limp. It was enough. Monroe partnered with Agent Holloway and traveled to Idaho Falls, tracing the arrest location. It was a shuttered industrial lot long since sold off. After some digging, They located the former owner, a man named Clyde Rasmussen, now retired. Clyde confirmed that he once rented a corner unit to a man with a limp and a quiet, nervous energy. Never gave me trouble. Paid cash. Moved out middle of the night in fall of '91. Said he was heading to Montana. Never saw him again. Montana. They followed the thread. A new name came up. Eli V. Hartman listed on a library card application in Livingston, Montana in 1992. No photo, but the signature was nearly identical to the ones on Voss's earlier documents. Under the radar again. This man, if it was Ethan, had spent over a decade hiding in plain sight, moving between remote regions, avoiding digital footprints, using different names, but never abandoning the wilderness. And every time he moved, someone nearby disappeared. A retired ranger in Idaho recalled a missing camper in '89. A hiker vanished near Yellowstone in '93. And now with this trail reopening, there was renewed urgency. Back in Yosemite, the remains in the shallow grave were finally confirmed through mitochondrial DNA. Rebecca Whitaker. Daniels were still inconclusive, but Emily, now in her late 40s, received the news with quiet devastation. She said, "I always knew they didn't just get lost. I just didn't know someone else was watching them." As Monroe reviewed everything, the timeline, the sightings, the arrests, she began preparing something rare for a case as old, a federal fugitive bulletin. After 13 years, the man suspected of murdering Daniel and Rebecca Whitaker was no longer just a ghost in the forest. He had a face. He had a name. And somewhere out there, he was still walking, maybe with that same dragging limp, and someone else might be next. The Federal Fugitive Bulletin for Ethan Voss, a.k.a. Eli Vaughn, a.k.a. Eli V. Hartman, was issued quietly, distributed through internal law enforcement channels and wilderness ranger offices across the western United States. The description included white male born circa 1950, approximately 5 feet 11 inches, average build, pronounced limp on the left leg, known to frequent forested and mountainous regions, may use aliases and operate off-grid, suspected in multiple wilderness-related disappearances. Though public disclosure was withheld for now to avoid media contamination of leads, the alert yielded its first breakthrough within days. A call came from Kalispell, Montana. A woman in her late 60s named Margaret Shields said she'd seen the man the bulletin described, not once, but for an entire summer. He stayed near our Trailhead campground in the summer of '94. Said his name was Eli, kept to himself, had a bad leg, told me he was a writer. He gave me a drawing once. She still had it. Monroe and Holloway arrived at her home 2 days later. The drawing was folded into an old paperback novel, a pencil sketch of a wooded glen, detailed and serene. But in the corner, barely noticeable, was something more chilling. A human silhouetted near a ridge watching. Holloway examined the signature. It matched the ones found in the Yosemite cabin sketches. "That's him," Monroe said softly. Margaret looked shaken. "There's more." He asked me questions about people, about the types who hiked alone. He said he liked solitude, too. But I always felt it wasn't just about the trees. Monroe requested names of other campers that summer. Only one stood out as missing. Jonas Weaver, a 24-year-old hiker from Missoula who vanished in July of 1994. His car was found at the trailhead. No trace of him was ever recovered. Until now. His case was cold and unconnected. The FBI now had cause to believe that Ethan Voss may have been a serial predator, operating not in cities or neighborhoods, but in the remote corners of nature, where records were minimal and the silence worked in his favor. Monroe added a new section to her case board. Suspected victims Daniel Whitaker, Rebecca Whitaker, Jonas Weaver, unconfirmed hiker, Cherry Creek 85, unconfirmed Yellowstone 93. Each name was accompanied by a photo, some faded, some fresh, but one by one the pattern emerged. Always remote, always alone or in pairs, always in places Ethan knew better than they did. And then Monroe asked herself something that chilled her to the bone. What if he never stopped? By now. The scope of the case had shifted from solving a cold disappearance to hunting a potential serial killer who had evaded law enforcement for over 3 decades. Detective Monroe and Agent Holloway created a behavioral profile map, a timeline of known and suspected movements tied to Ethan Voss's aliases. It wasn't perfect, but it showed a disturbing pattern. 1986 Yosemite, California. Whitaker disappearance. 1989 Payette National Forest, Idaho. Unidentified hiker vanishes. 1991 Idaho falls arrest as Eli Vaughn. 1993 Yellowstone region, Montana. Unsolved missing persons case. 1994 Kalispell, Montana. Margaret Shields sighting. No known activity post-1995. Had he died? Was he arrested under yet another name? Or had he simply disappeared into the woods for good? Monroe feared the last answer the most. She made the decision to contact outdoor survivalist communities, wilderness forums, even YouTube channels focused on backcountry exploration. Quietly and carefully, she shared the description, not naming Ethan, but suggesting caution and seeking info on a man known as Eli, traveling solo, sketching, limping, often interviewing hikers about solitude. And then something unexpected happened. A user on a private survivalist forum responded. A man calling himself Ridge Runner 37 posted this message. Saw a guy just like that near Bob Marshall Wilderness, Montana, summer of '09. Said he was researching patterns of human behavior in isolation. Limped, drew pictures, looked right through you. Monroe reached out immediately. They tracked the user down, a former smoke jumper named Keith Delaney, now living in Spokane. He sat across from Monroe in Holloway, his jaw set tight. He gave me the creeps like a ghost in boots. Said he'd been out there a long time. Offered me a drawing, but I didn't take it. Just wanted to leave. Said his name was Ellis. Now you're saying he might have hurt people. Monroe nodded. We believe he has, and we're afraid he may do it again. Delaney paused, thinking, I know where I saw him. There's a ridge out near the Chinese Wall. Remote even by Montana standards. No cell signal, no trails, no shelters. He was moving toward it. That location became the next target. A specialized FBI team was assembled. Wilderness search experts, trackers, forensic agents, and field medics. They weren't searching for remains anymore. They were hunting a man who had lived in the woods for 30 years, who had studied his terrain like a predator, and had perhaps grown more elusive than ever. If he was still alive, he knew how to disappear. But this time, they knew his face. And for the first time in decades, someone was finally coming for him. The Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex is one of the most isolated regions in the contiguous United States, spanning over 1 million acres. Its spine is a Chinese Wall, a sheer 1,000-foot limestone escarpment stretching more than 20 miles to the Montana backcountry. Few reach it, fewer stay. It was here in the shadow of this monumental ridge that the FBI believed Ethan Voss had retreated. The search team, 12 men and women, departed under the guise of a wildlife survey team to avoid public attention or tipping off the suspect. They carried infrared drones, silent satellite beacons, and enough supplies for 10 days in hostile terrain. Detective Monroe joined them. Agent Holloway remained behind to coordinate communication and prepare capture logistics should Voss be found. 3 days into the trek, the team split into units. Monroe's group followed the ridgeline south, keeping eyes on natural caves and ridgelines. It was slow, grueling work, the kind Voss himself would have been used to. And then on the 4th evening, as the sun bled behind the peaks, they found a trace. Nestled beneath a dense cluster of evergreens, Monroe saw at first a fire ring. Cold but recent, charcoal bits not yet bleached by sun or wind. Beside it, a tarp leaned to collapse but intentionally placed. And beneath it, a notebook wrapped in plastic tied with fishing line. They brought it back to camp and unsealed it. Inside were pages of sketches again, but these were different. They weren't of landscapes. They were of people, 4 of them in particular, drawn from a distance but unmistakably detailed. A ranger, binoculars in hand, a female hiker with red braids, a man sitting alone near a creek, and Detective Linda Monroe kneeling by the fire ring she had just found. It was drawn before she had even noticed she was being watched. One page scrolled in unfamiliar handwriting read, "Some animals chase their shadows. Others know when they're being hunted." Monroe's breath caught in her throat. "He's here. He knows we're here. The search had just escalated from recovery, the confrontation. Now, it wasn't a question of if they find Ethan Voss. It was a question of who would find whom first. The wilderness went deathly still. After finding the sketch of herself, Detective Monroe couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The realization that Ethan Voss, or whatever name he now used, had observed the team without being detected meant one thing. He was no longer hiding. He was studying them. That night, the team set up a silent perimeter, using infrared motion detectors and thermal scopes, but the forest swallowed sound, and shadows moved like whispers. Every snapped twig sent hearts pounding. At 3:47 a.m., one of the sensors triggered. Monroe was first out her tent. The others followed, weapons ready, lights off. They followed the alert to a ridge just 200 yards from base camp. There, in the middle of the trail, stood something deliberate. A stack of rocks, a car crudely built, newly made. On top of it, balanced like a crown, was a ripped page from the sketchbook. It was another drawing, this time of a search team member, face covered by binoculars, rifle slung low, the date written beside it that very day. He had been close enough to draw them again, and he'd left it as a message. "He's circling us," one agent muttered. Monroe stared at the rocks. "No, he's controlling the terrain. He knows we're here, and he's showing us that he's still in control." They took no further steps that night. Instead, Monroe proposed something different. "We won't chase him anymore," she said. "We let him come to us. We show him that the trap is already set." The next day, a decoy camp was established further down the trail, placed to appear vulnerable and unguarded. Monron remained behind in the original location with 2 tactical agents and a drone operator stationed in a camouflage perch nearby. Hours passed. Then, just before sunset, movement flickered in the tree inn. The drone picked up a heat signature. Tall, slow-moving, leaning to one side. It stopped every few feet, always watching. Monroe and her team held their breath as the signature neared the decoy site, and then it vanished, gone mid-stride. No running, no shift, just vanished. The team swarmed the area, but there were no tracks, no fresh breaks in branches, just the sound of wind and distant water. And one more thing, a small note pinned under a stone near the path. Written in pencil, the paper said, "I don't live in your world. You stepped into mine. Turn back. Some things aren't meant to be found." No signature, no footprints, just a warning. Monroe folded the paper silently, then turned to the team. "He's not running. He's luring, and he knows this land better than anyone alive." Now, the predator wasn't just aware of their presence. He was playing with it, and now they had to ask, were they hunting Ethan Voss, or had they walked straight into his trap? Following the unnerving message and vanishing heat signature, the team's confidence began to crack. One of the younger agents, Jason Hale, requested to be pulled from the field. "This guy, he's not just surviving out here. He's hunting, watching, tracking us like we're the ones trespassing." Detective Monroe didn't argue. Everyone had their limit, and this case was starting to feel less like an investigation and more like a slow descent into someone else's mind. She sent Hale back with a chopper schedule for resupply. That night, the remaining members gathered at the fire in silence. No theories, no assumptions, just eyes scanning the dark. And that's when Monroe spoke, her voice low. "He's not a ghost. He's a man. He eats. He sleeps. He gets cold. And at some point he's going to get tired." They needed to find his nest, his central camp, the place where he returned, rested, and studied his next move. Based on the sketches, the fire rings, and the movement patterns, they triangulated a new search radius deeper toward a narrow gorge known locally as Witch's Hollow, a place hikers avoided due to steep terrain and sudden fogs that rolled in from the west. Local legend aside, Monroe was certain that's where he'd go, somewhere nobody else would. Day 8 of the search. They descended into Witch's Hollow with climbing gear and thermal drones. The area was dense, overgrown with moss-covered boulders, gnarled cedar roots, and a faint animal path that seemed to disappear the deeper they went. At the base of the hollow, tucked beneath an overhang of stone, they found it, a shelter, not a tarp, not a lean-to. A fully constructed underground dugout reinforced with timber camouflaged with brush and deadfall invisible from above. Inside, they found a fire pit with old scorch bones, tin cans meticulously cleaned and repurposed as tools, a water collection system using moss and stones. And most chilling of all, dozens of notebooks arranged like a library, every one of them filled with drawings, maps, journal entries, and names. Some were crossed out, others were circled. In one book, they found a list labeled still, and under it, 6 names. For verified missing persons, including Daniel and Rebecca Whitaker. 2 were unknown. Next to them, sketches grim, detailed, intimate. These weren't just victims. They were targets. Monroe photographed everything, hands shaking. Then, tucked between the floorboards, one final object, a locket. Inside a photo, faded, water damaged, but recognizable. It was Rebecca, smiling, alive. This was more than a hunter's lair. It was a shrine. And they weren't just close to Ethan Voss. They were standing inside his mind. The silence inside the dugout was suffocating. Detective Monroe stood in the dim space. The smell of moss and old would thicken her lungs. The locket, now sealed in an evidence bag, trembled slightly in her gloved hand. It wasn't just a trophy. It was personal, intimate. He kept her with him, she said aloud. Agent Torres, the team's forensic analyst, was crouched over a pile of charcoal sketches in the back corner. Many were smeared, damp, and rotting, but few were preserved in wax paper. One showed a woman, Rebecca Whitaker, not just drawn, but studied page after page. In one, she was walking by a lake. In another, sleeping in a tent. In another, still, she was drawn holding hands with Daniel, staring into the fire. They weren't just memories. They were moments he had witnessed. He lived among them. Torres murmured. He was there watching, maybe even before they knew he existed. Monroe stepped back and surveyed the whole space. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't frantic. It was orderly, like a museum of his mind. Everything in place, documented, sorted. On the back wall, scratched faintly into the timber frame, were 3 words. The quiet ones. Outside, rain began to fall. Light at first, then heavier, soaking the canopy and swallowing sound. Agent Dorsey, stationed above ground, called an over radio. Movement ridge to the east 30 yard. Can't get a visual. Too much fog. Monroe responded. Hold position. Do not engage unless fired upon. The team secured the dugout and ascended carefully. It was almost nightfall and the forest had gone still again. But as they reached the top of the hollow, Torres turned and pointed. In the soft mud, a single footprint fresh, deep, right outside the entrance. He was here, Torres whispered. He watched us the whole time. Monroe scanned the tree in, heart hammering. He's not hiding anymore. He's leading us. That night at base camp, the team reviewed what they'd found. The journals revealed new names. One in particular stood out. C. Renner. A hiker reported missing in 1998 near the Absaroka Mountains, an entirely different part of Montana. The case had long been buried in a local sheriff's file. Now it was clear Renner had also crossed paths with Ethan Voss. Even more disturbing was a final entry in one of the notebooks. Sometimes I think they know, but they don't. They're loud. They forget. That's why they vanish. I stay still. Monroe didn't sleep that night. None of them did, because the truth was no longer just about Rebecca and Daniel. It was about how many more had been taken, how many had never been found, and how he was still out there walking in the dark, listening, sketching, and waiting. The storm moved in hard for 48 hours. Torrential rain pinned the team to their temporary shelter. Tents strained under the weight of water. Equipment shorted. Drones grounded. Even satellite signals flickered in and out. But the worst part wasn't the weather. It was what came with it. On the second night, Monroe awoke to find a small object placed just inside the boundary of camp, just beyond the reach of their sensor lines. A tin can, the kind they'd seen in the dugout, now carefully sealed. Inside, a strip of animal hide, a piece of charcoal, and a folded piece of paper. The drawing was unmistakable. It was of Monroe herself, sleeping in her tent, curled toward the rain, her sidearm half visible beside her. The charcoal strokes were exact, too exact. He had been inside the camp, and no one had seen him. After sunrise, they found more signs. Twigs bent in patterns, a smear of soot on a tree. Each signal subtle, deliberate, a language that Ethan Voss had cultivated alone for years. It wasn't madness. It was method. And then they found the grave. It wasn't deep, just a soft mound under a fir tree marked with a stack of stones. Inside, buried just beneath the surface, was the partial skeleton of a man tangled in what remained of a hiker's pack. Still zipped, a dog tag hung from a shoelace tied around the wrist. See, Renner. Confirmed. Voss had moved beyond sketching, beyond trophies. He was now leaving the messages with the dead. Monroe stared down into the shallow grave, rain soaking her sleeves. And for the first time in years, she felt something she'd buried long ago. Guilt. Because in 1990, when she was just a patrol deputy fresh out of the academy, a missing persons report had crossed her desk in Fresno County. A couple backpackers vanished near Sia. She dismissed it as a wrong turn. Never followed up, never filed an official report. Now, with Voss's name echoing through decades, she knew they'd been his too. He's been doing this longer than we imagined, she told Holloway later over radio. But Holloway was quiet on the other end. There's more, he said finally. Back at Quantico, we ran a deep link search using known aliases and sketch samples. One of the names popped up not in the U.S., but in northern Canada. A hunting license application, 2011 name used Yvonne. Photo inconclusive, but the handwriting matches. Voss had gone international. Monroe stared at the mountains beyond the hollow. He's not just evading us, she whispered. He's expanding. The case was no longer local, not even national. They were tracking a ghost who had learned how to survive in silence across borders, who had mastered solitude, fear, and terrain like a religion, and who still walked among the trees watching the loud ones vanish. Monroe sat beneath a canopy of blackened pines, reviewing every sketch they had recovered from Voss's shelter. She noticed something strange in one of the oldest journals. A page near the back, barely legible through water damage, showed a crude map. It wasn't the dugout. It marked another location further east, deeper into the Scapegoat Plateau with 3 X's and a number. Coordinates? Torres asked. Maybe, Monroe replied. Or victims. She cross-referenced the marks with old ranger charts. The location matched a cluster of high granite bluffs near a collapsed mining site, an area rarely visited, known for unstable ground and frequent fog cover. Perfect place for a second site, she said. Or a trap, Torres added. Still, they had to follow the lead. They broke camp at dawn. The route to the bluffs was brutal, wind-blown, cluttered with downed trees and uneven rock. As they climbed higher, visibility dropped to mere meters. Radios crackled. Every step echoed. And then, just before dusk, they found it. A second shelter. This one older, rougher, hidden beneath a rocky outcrop and covered in moss. Inside were 3 distinct loves. Each one bore evidence of habitation, worn bedding, empty cans. One alcove even had a child's shoe blackened with age. But the most disturbing find came from the smallest alcove. Pinned to the wall with a rusted nail was a Polaroid photograph. Rebecca Whitaker, bruised, alive, terrified, and beneath it, written in faded marker. They stayed. The implication hit Monroe like a blow to the chest. They had assumed Voss killed quickly, like a predator striking then disappearing. But now there was another possibility. He had kept them alive. Outside, the fog thickened. The search team fanned out. Torres sweeping the edge of the bluff. That's when he called out. Movement. West slope. Single figure. Large build. Limping 20M. They gave chase. But when they reached the spot, there was no one. Just another K. Another note. This one was different. It read, they asked to stay. You're the ones who keep digging. And below it, a crude drawing of 6 figures. 5 lying down, 1 watching from a tree. That night, Monroe sat alone near the campfire, the journal on her lap, the Polaroid photograph of Rebecca burning into her memory. The truth was no longer hidden. Voss had kept people alive. For how long? No one knew. and whether Rebecca had died in that forest or escaped only to vanish again was still uncertain. But one thing was now clear. Ethan Voss wasn't finished, and neither was she. The next morning, Monroe made a decision that unnerved even her most seasoned agents. We split up. The terrain around the second shelter was too complex, too fragmented for a full team to move efficiently. Voss knew their rhythm. He had learned their sound. To outmaneuver him, they had to break it. 2-man teams for hour rotations. No fire, no lights. After dusk, we don't track him anymore. We wait. Monroe paired with Torres and headed southeast toward a dry ravine lined with skeletal pines. The silence there was eerie, unnatural, like the earth itself held its breath. Hours passed. Then at 1:23 p.m. they heard it. A whistle. Low. 2 short bursts. Not bird call. Human deliberate. They followed. At the edge of the ravine, Monroe spotted it. Movement behind a crumbling tree stump. She raised her weapon. Motioned Torres left and stepped forward. Federal agents, show your hands. Nothing. She moved in slowly, and then a shadow bolted. They gave chase. Boots slamming wet soil, limbs slicing through brush. The figure was tall, ragged, and fast despite the limp. But just as they closed the gap, he vanished into the mist. They reached a clearing, lungs burning. No man. But in the center of the clearing sat a wooden box recently uncovered from the earth. And inside 6 rings, 2 driver's licenses aged and cracked, a pair of broken glasses, and one final locket not Rebecca's, but identical in style, etched into the underside of the box lid. They belonged here. You don't. That night, Monroe didn't sleep. She stayed up cataloging the items, cross-referencing old missing persons reports. Every item matched a victim previously unconnected to Voss. He had been operating longer than anyone had realized, and his obsession wasn't just with survival. It was with ownership, with claiming those who belonged to silence, the ones who stayed. She whispered. 2 days later, Holloway called in. We have a hit. In a remote border checkpoint in British Columbia, a ranger had encountered an older man traveling alone. No ID, limp, unshaven, matching Voss's general description. He'd shown an old passport under the name Eli Vaughn, but by the time authorities tried to detain him, he had vanished again, leaving behind only a sketch pad and a trash bin. Inside, a fresh drawing. Rebecca Whitaker. Same face, same smile, but in this one, she was older. Wrinkles at the eyes, hair longer, darker. He imagines them aging as if they kept living with him. The chase wasn't over. In fact, it had expanded. The wilderness was no longer the hunting ground. Now they had to ask the unthinkable. What if Voss wasn't just hiding? What if he was searching for the next one? A week passed with no further sign of Ethan Voss. The Canadian border sighting had rattled the team, especially Monroe. If he had crossed into British Columbia undetected, there was no telling how far his network of trails, caches, and sanctuaries extended. But then came the breakthrough. Agent Torres, while reviewing a box of field photos taken months earlier near the original Whitaker campsite, found something that had been dismissed. A blurred shape caught in the background of a riverbank shot. Not quite a man, not quite shadow. Using AI enhancement and filters, the tech team clarified the image. It showed a figure crouching in the trees, wearing patchwork clothing, holding what appeared to be a camera. Voss hadn't just been sketching. He had been documenting. Monroe ordered a full re-sweep of the area, this time focusing not on evidence of human presence, footprints, shelters, but on optics. If Voss had a camera, there could be a stash of tapes, photos, or film somewhere nearby. And they found it tucked inside a hollowed-out cedar stump camouflaged with pine resin and dirt, a waterproof container. Inside a rusted Super 8 film reel, 2 disposable cameras, 1 cracked, outdated digital recorder. The devices were degraded but recoverable. They rushed them to Quantico for analysis. What they uncovered chilled every agent involved. The Super 8 film, though grainy and silent, showed a young woman, Rebecca Whitaker, pacing inside a makeshift cabin. No chains, no restraints, but she looked thin, tired, always glancing toward the door. The footage spanned at least 3 seasons. Autumn leaves, then snow, then green again. She had survived at least a year after her disappearance, and someone Voss had filmed her. The digital recorder revealed even more audio clips, dozens. Most were static or intelligible, but a few were clear. In one, a woman's voice whispered, "He doesn't talk much, but he listens. I don't know if I'm free or if I'm just not dead yet." And in another, a male voice, flat, steady, said, "They keep asking why I stayed. They don't understand. The world is louder out there." Monroe played it again and again, not because of the content, but because of the background noise. In one clip, faint but unmistakable, was the sound of a train whistle. "That's not near here," Torres said. "There are no active rail lines in this forest." Monroe nodded slowly. "But there is one 2 counties east. Decommissioned, but the track's still there." They traced the location to an abandoned rail depot near Greystone Pass, a mining town turned ghost settlement in the late 7s. No residents, no cell service, no oversight. The perfect place to vanish, and possibly to keep someone alive. Monroe assembled a new team, smaller, quieter. She left behind the forensic analysts, the texts, the noise. This next part was personal, because now they weren't just hunting a ghost. They were looking for someone who might still be breathing. And if she was, Rebecca Whitaker had survived 13 years in silence. The town of Greystone Pass was a name most locals had forgotten. Built during a mining boom in the 1920s, it was abandoned by the late 70s when the silver dried up and the rail line was decommissioned. What remained were the skeletal outlines of houses, a collapsed general store, and a rusted station platform swallowed by weeds. But according to old maps, one structure remained intact, a rail supervisor's cabin tucked into the hillside above the depot that became Monroe's destination. She and her reduced team hiked in undercover dusk, moving with tactical precision. Radios were kept silent, no drone surveillance. This was a ghost town, and they didn't want to disturb the spirits too soon. As they approached the cabin, they saw the signs. Not fresh footprints, but intentional misdirection. Branches placed across trails, false trails ending in dense brush. Voss had led people into traps before. Monroe wasn't going to be one of them. They circled, flanked the cabin from above, and waited until first light. The building stood quietly in the fog, its windows dark, the door slightly ajar. "No heat signature," Torres whispered. "But the walls are thick," Monroe gave the signal. 3 agents fanned out. One approached the door. They entered. Inside, the air was dry, heavy with dust and cedar. The interior was minimalist. Caught table shelf. No electricity, no plumbing. But on the table sat a photo album. It was hand-bound, leather-covered, and full of photographs never made public. Daniel and Rebecca at the Yosemite trailhead. Rebecca laughing beside a stream. A nighttime shot of their tent from a distance. These weren't souvenirs. They were moments stolen by someone who had never stopped watching. And then came the final photo. Rebecca, older, seated on the porch of this very cabin, looking away from the camera, hair streaked with gray, a blanket across her lap. The date on the back was October 11th, 1998, just 4 months before the team found the backpack behind the waterfall. Monroe turned to Torres. She was here. This was real. They swept the cabin inch by inch. In a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, they found 2 more items. A compass etched with the initials RW, and a journal filled with pages of Rebecca's handwriting. She had written every day. Some pages were observations, others were confessions. He calls it the stillness. He says I'm better now, that the noise is gone, that I'm one of the quiet ones. I stopped fighting. I don't know if that makes me dead already. And later, I dream of Daniel. I remember the beach. I hope someone is looking. Monroe felt the weight of it in her chest. All those years, Rebecca had been alive, trapped, riding into the dark. And then she stopped. The final entry was short. The snow came early. He hasn't returned. I don't know if this is freedom or the end. There were no remains in the cabin, no signs of struggle, no blood, just silence. As if Voss had returned one day and taken everything again, or perhaps left it all behind. Back outside, the wind swept to the pines and over the rails. It carried with it a sound distant, metallic, echoing off the gorge, a whistle. Not from a train, from a man. Somewhere in the trees, he still watched and waited. The sound of the whistle faded, but its echo lingered like a warning. Monroe raised her binoculars toward the eastern ridge. Dense pines, morning mist. Nothing moved, but she knew he was there. Ethan Voss wasn't running. He was inviting them. They stayed another night in Greystone Pass, setting silent perimeter sensors and hidden trail cams. The cabin was now their base, a shrine turned staging ground. At 2:14 a.m., a sensor tripped. Torres checked the feed. A figure, tall, motionless, standing at the tree and not approaching, just watching. And then slowly he raised his hand, not in surrender, in recognition. By the time Monroe reached the ridge, he was gone. But at the base of the pine where he stood was a new package wrapped in canvas tied with sinew. Inside a rusted camcorder, early 2000s, one cassette tape, a handwritten note, short and direct. You still don't listen. They hiked out the next morning and rushed contents back to Quantico. The camcorder was dead, but the tape was intact. Text digitized it within the hour. The footage was rough, grainy, unsteady, but what it showed stole the air from the room. It was Rebecca Whitaker again, speaking directly to the camera, her face worn but determined. If anyone finds this, I want to be remembered not as a victim, but as someone who survived longer than anyone expected. He's not a monster. He's a believer. He thinks this land is sacred, that silence is pure, that noise kills. He calls us echoes, says we were loud once, but we've learned. I don't know if I ever escaped. I think maybe I stayed too long. Maybe I became one of them. But if Daniel's family is still out there, I'm sorry. He tried. He fought for me until the end. She smiled weakly. The waterfall was my idea. He didn't want to leave me behind. The tape ended. There was no timestamp, no clue where she was now or even if she was still alive, but it confirmed what Monroe had feared. Rebecca had survived, and she may have chosen silence. That night, Monroe walked alone to the dark perimeter of the FBI compound, the cold biting into her coat. She lit a cigarette, a habit long dormant, and stared at the stars. What if we're chasing someone who's not running? She said to no one. What if we are the ones disturbing the peace? The next morning, Holloway called her in. We found something else. A satellite scan had picked up a heat signature in a remote stretch of forest near the Canadian border. No trails, no roads, just a cluster of natural hot springs known to few outside old ranger logs. He thinks it's him or someone, Holloway said. Monroe didn't hesitate. Then we go. The final approach would be the most dangerous yet. No backup, no signals, just a narrow window and the possibility of answers. Answers about Rebecca, about Daniel, about the lives Ethan Voss had taken, and those he had shaped in his image. And maybe finally they'd understand what it meant to be one of the quiet ones. The helicopter couldn't land. The last 10 miles into the borderland springs would have to be made on foot. Steep, freezing terrain, littered with ice-coated boulders and brittle deadfall. It was as if the land itself wanted to keep secrets buried. Monroe, Torres, and 2 select agents moved in silence. No radios, no signal pings, nothing that could be heard beyond the crunch of frost under boots. By noon, they reached the edge of the hot springs basin. Rising steam clung to the trees like ghosts. The air smelled of sulfur and moss. Then they saw it, a cabin hand-built, partially submerged into the slope, barely more than a bunker. Fresh smoke curled from a stone chimney. And outside, perched on a crude bench, was a man still waiting. Ethan Voss. He didn't move as they approached, didn't reach for a weapon, didn't run. Just stared as if expecting them. Monroe stopped 10 feet away. Ethan Voss, you're under federal investigation for multiple disappearances, including Rebecca Whitaker, Daniel Reyes, and numerous others. He said nothing. Then finally you made it too loud. His voice was dry but calm. You came all this way for her. For the woman who wanted to stay. Monroe didn't flinch. Is she alive? A pause. Then he stood slowly, deliberately. She was for a time. He turned and walked toward the cabin. The agents followed, weapons low but ready. Inside it was warm, too warm for the altitude. A wood stove crackled. Along the walls were shelves filled with books, field journals, photographs, and in the far corner, a grave marker, a simple wooden plank carved with one name, Rebecca. Monroe approached it slowly. There were dried wild flowers at its base, carefully arranged, recently placed. "She died here," she asked, voice low. Voss nodded. "She asked me to bury her in the quiet." Torres whispered, "Do you believe him?" Monroe's jaw clenched. "I believe she stayed." They took Voss into custody, without resistance. No outburst, no confession, just silence. In the weeks that followed, Monroe pored over the evidence found in the cabin. Dozens of tapes, hundreds of photos, journals written in multiple hands. Some likely belonging to Rebecca, others to earlier victims. One journal entry stood out in ink soft and deliberate. "Not all who vanish are taken. Some walk willingly into silence." Voss refused to speak after his arrest. At his arraignment, he sat quietly. At trial, he stared at the walls. When offered a plea deal for disclosure of grave sites, he declined. In the end, he was convicted on overwhelming forensic evidence, but even then he never explained why. Monroe returned once more to Greystone Pass alone. She stood on the crumbling platform, wind rushing through the trees, and for the first time didn't listen for footsteps. She listened to nothing. And in that moment, she understood it wasn't just about death. It was about escape, about the unbearable noise of a world that never stops talking, and the terrible seductive appeal of becoming invisible. Some disappear because they're taken. Some disappear because they're lost. And some because the silence calls them by name. Rebecca Whitaker's name was never found on a headstone, but in that forest, in that cabin, in every whisper of wind through pine, she remained. Wind,